Okay, so we're getting back into Christian ethics. So, first of all, I just want to say I hope that everyone is staying safe, uh, staying home, if you're able to do that. Um, and we're going to get through this. So, it's going to be a little bit different. I think what I wanted to start was, a lot of students were absent last time, so I think I'm going to do just kind of a real quick run through the last part of what we were talking about, and then kind of finish up what we didn't quite get to. We're talking about recent developments in Christian ethics, um, and a lot of what that is. So, some of it's going to look familiar. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through some of the earlier parts, but that's where we're going to go. So, to kind of keep going there. There we go. Okay, so just kind of remember an outline of where we're going to be going. So we're going to be talking about what postmodernism is. And we're going to back up a little bit, talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which is you would not categorize as postmodernist. And then we're going to talk about some of the new forms of orthodoxy, and that's going to be primarily centered around Karl Barth, Alistair McIntyre, and John Milbank. And we're going to spend some time talking about the Christological turn with Stanley Hauerwas and John Howard Yoder. And then very briefly at the end, talk about some Jewish developments in Jewish ethics specifically. We are going to kind of leave for the time being the stuff from Samuel Wells. We did talk about that in class and the reading there. If you haven't done the reading, please do that. What's the difference between between Eton and Waterloo, or where the battle is won is won at Eton rather than Waterloo. That whole distinction there that he makes, that really Duke of Wellington made. So anyway, go back and do the reading if you haven't done that. For now, we're going to leave that, and we're going to just go through kind of, like I said, a little bit more rapid style here. So we're talking about postmodernism. Now, postmodernism, like I said, is one of those slippery terms. It's kind of ill-defined. Really, with what's currently called postmodernism, first of all, not everything that is called postmodernism is postmodernism. And whether even postmodernism is a thing is a whole separate issue. But it is somewhat helpful to kind of talk about some of these issues, especially because we're going through a lot of history of Western philosophy very quickly to get to this point, which is really where we start getting into modern Christian ethics. So between this time and next time, we're finishing up a lot of the background of this lecture and next lecture. Finishing up a lot of the background issues, and then we'll start getting into more specific issues like environmentalism, care, end of life care, those type of issues we'll actually start talking about next over the next few weeks and that sort of thing. So talk about postmodernism, though, it is this kind of more loosely ill-defined concept. It really is more of a response or retaliation to modernism. So, like I said, most philosophers agree that really, if we're going to be honest, postmodernism is an aspect of modernism. That's not really, there's some question as to how post it is. All right, so real quickly, like I said, we've talked about this in class, with some of the characteristics, and you're not going to see this with everything that would fit within postmodernism. A lot of it is just a response to where modernism was. But there is an emphasis on skepticism. There's an inherent distrust of institutions. The big point is that it's post-structuralist or post-foundationalist. And remember what we talked about with the beginning of, really with Descartes. You see a little bit of that earlier, perhaps with Francis Bacon. But you have this idea of we need some kind of foundation for our beliefs, including our ethical beliefs. So that's what they're trying to do, very heavily centered around what happened with the Enlightenment and that kind of thing. It ends up being what we want is to have some kind of objective foundation that anyone, anywhere thinking about that foundation could, or thinking about it, just thinking about it in the right way. If you just think about things and approach things in the right way, we'll get to some foundation. And kind of the paradigmatic one of that was Descartes' cogito, I think, therefore I am. That's kind of where he starts his foundation and he builds up to existence, the existence of God, the duality of the body soul, all that. But it has that same common foundation. And you see Kant probably is the most thoroughgoing attempt to do this in ethics. Now, he does this in epistemology first, like we talked about, and a few other things, but he also does this in ethics, where he tries to get at that kind of foundational principle based upon reason and rationality and build up to everything else there. And for Kant, ethics just boils down to this one very foundational principle of the categorical imperative. It's just logically consistent. So the post-foundationalist bit comes about largely due to Friedrich Nietzsche, who, as we'll see, particularly with MacIntyre, he really kind of highlights that issue that really we don't have a foundation with this. When we look at Descartes' I think, therefore I am, he's already presuming that he exists, and even in the Latin, it doesn't really help you out. I mean, if you the worst translation of thought, therefore being, well, thought is still assuming that there's something thinking that thought. Like it's presuming the existence of the thing to be proved. So that's what we call begging the question. It's circular logic. It doesn't really get at what it's trying to do. And so post-foundationalism is an acknowledgement of that fact. It definitely came to fruition on the European continent before it came with a lot of analytic philosophy. In fact, for a long time, analytic philosophy tried to hold on to this idea that we can get to this foundational, fundamental belief and then build up from there. This was like the logical positivists of the early 20th century with their emphasis on logic and math and science, that was going to get all the answers for everything. And we find out that really at some point there's just an assumption that's made. And that was really, fundamentally, that was Nietzsche's point, that there is no foundation upon it, that it's all just swept away. So that's the big, big key point here. We're going to talk about that. Some of these other characteristics, because of that, because of the loss of foundationalism and structuralism, they tend to de-emphasize a lot of the recent developments. They're not going to completely ignore them. In fact, they talk quite a bit about them. But they de-emphasize, using those recent philosophical developments, and instead they go back to ancient or medieval, really just anything that we might consider pre-modern philosophical developments in history there. So you see that, again, when we get to MacIntyre, it's very heavily based upon virtue ethics in Aristotle and Aquinas, and that really tends to be where a lot of Christian ethics goes as a result of this. There is a bigger emphasis on community and relationships, and how that kind of internal consistency within a community becomes really, really important. And then there's an emphasis on narrative and meta-narrative, that there's this broader story, and that you have a story and that fits into a bigger story, especially when we talk about Christian postmodernism. That idea of narrative and meta-narrative becomes really important, because for the Christian postmodernist, God is the one who's telling the story. He's the one who is driving this bigger, broader meta-narrative. And your kind of miniature narrative, or even these other narratives, they fit into that bigger narrative. There becomes a more decentralized understanding of truth. You don't get this as much with a lot of Christian postmodernism, although it does show up. But you have truth with a capital T becomes truth, lowercase t becomes a truth, meaning that there are multiple ones becomes your truth. So we have kind of that move from Platonism to what becomes a little bit more like, okay, well, maybe there are multiple truths. You see this in the early 20th century, to, well, there could be any truths. And then just your truth. What's true for you may not be true for me. This is not, universal, as I said. Now these are universal, but this one really you see a lot more variance with. There's also a shift toward the relativistic, or even a rejection of ethics entirely. Again, we're not going to look into that too terribly much. For purposes of our class dealing with Christian ethics, that's not as important. You may see some things that look like they could be considered relativism. But really what they're looking at is the ethics and conversations happening within a community. And that's not necessarily exclusive of other communities. A lot of times they're just saying that they can't make a statement or declaration. They're not equipped to do so for epistemological reasons, not for any kind of foundational or metaphysical reasons or ontological reasons or anything like that. Okay, so kind of moving on with that. So postmodernist ethics. The article that we talked about, the first one that talked about kind of delves into this initially, is really not that postmodernist. This is the McCormick, Moral Ambiguity and Proportionalism. It is a decisionist ethics. That is, it helps you make the decision of what to do in a moral dilemma. And the big point of this whole proportionalism is the notion of dual effect. That sometimes, either through your action or inaction, other effects happen that you did not intend. And for McCormick, inaction can sometimes even be worse than action and results in what he labels non-moral evil as well. There are sometimes just bad things that happen, but there's not really any kind of moral consequence about it. Natural disasters might fit into this category as well. So when you are faced with a moral conflict for McCormick, he essentially argues that you have to do this kind of, calculus in your head about, what we're going to do. That, committing one action might result in an unintended consequence or a dual effect where one thing is wicked, but your intent is still to do something good. And so how you decide where to do is that you consider, for McCormick, the order bonorum. That is this kind of moral hierarchy. And so there is a moral hierarchy. Preservation of life, would say would be above perhaps preservation of property, different things like that. But the intent, your intent needs to, it is very important. So when you have these kind of dual effects happen, it's all right if you acknowledge that they're there, but your intent cannot be like that you want that evil effect to happen. So for him, if your intent is to limit evil, even if that necessitates that you do commit an evil, that is still a moral good. So the example might be, this is frequently used example. You are you're in a country where there is lots of warfare going on. There are these warlords. There's lawlessness. You're captured by one of these warlords, and he takes you, and as his form of kind of messing with your head, he gives you a gun that has one bullet in it, and there are 10 prisoners lined up, and you are asked, can you, if you will kill one of them, I will release the other 9. But if you refuse to pull the trigger and kill one of them, then I will kill all 10. And McCormick would look at that and say, well, yes, it's still evil. You can still acknowledge that it's a moral evil to kill someone. But in this instance, because of this hierarchy of goodness, it's a moral good to kill one for the preservation of 9. Now, a lot more goes into that. You have to think about how trustworthy the source is. Is that actually going to happen? That kind of thing. So these are all things you have to consider. It is complicated. But McCormick, is essentially trying to be very practical with his ethics. He acknowledges that, okay, we don't live in the ideal world. There's this massive gulf between where we are and where that ideal world is, due to the effects of sin. So what we can achieve is what we need to focus on. Not what we would do in a perfect world, but what is achievable right here and right now. And then for McCormick, there's also this idea that moral goodness is a process that leads to sanctification. So that's a big part of what he's talking about as well. And there's, despite his emphasis on intent, he is pretty clear that he does not want to say that this is some kind of deontology or anything like that. So it's definitely not deontologist at all. And that's kind of his main point when he talks about these things. Okay, kind of moving on. The next kind of thinker that we get to is Joseph Fletcher, who kind of takes this moral ambiguity and presses the issue even more. And so his kind of main work is situation ethics, and he's more or less saying that he's wanting to get away from this idea that there are hard and fast rules about everything. That really you need to respond to whatever situation is in front of you. So what you should do depends very heavily on the situation, and he doesn't like these what-if scenarios. For him, there are no moral absolutes except for one, and that is the command to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, it's to love, love of God, he does acknowledge, but also to love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's really the guiding principle, is what he really prefers to refer to that as. It's not a rule, more as a guiding principle. So you need to find what is the most loving thing that I can do in any situation. And that's kind of how he talks about it. Now, there is a place for moral rules in Fletcher. He thinks that, like in sports, you have these kind of, rule of thumb things that you should do. So he says, like, don't swing on an away pitch unless you know, like, when to do it. Basically, if you are really adept at how to exercise that ethical muscle, you know kind of when to break the rule. So he does say that, there is a place for moral rules, but you have to be willing to break those from time to time. There are instances where that's allowed. And really for him, he wants to say this is not a system. Again, he wants to really get away from that idea of classroom ethics only, but really he believes it's an orientation or a strategy to the world. It's the way that I approach the world more broadly. So that is, in a nutshell, Joseph Fletcher's ethics. We just talked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm going to just real briefly talk about him. For Bonhoeffer, and the reading that we have, if you recall, is that excerpt from the very beginning of Custer's Discipleship, probably his most famous work. As I mentioned, he does have a work on ethics. It is a series of unfinished kind of notes, more or less. But the focus, at least for what we had from our readings, was that initial chapter. A little bit more broadly, for Bonhoeffer, there is this tension between the ultimate and the penultimate. By that, we are living in the penultimate, that period right before the ultimate. The ultimate being, Christ comes back, inaugurates his kingdom. That's the ultimate. So we're living in that tension, and that tension is what causes all these ethical quandaries that we have about us. For Bonhoeffer, though, it's not about a set of rules to follow. It still is about relationship. Now, he's not going to articulate it in the same way that Joseph Fletcher does, so you couldn't necessarily say it's quite as open to interpretation as all that, but it still is very heavily focused on relationship. And ethics for Bonhoeffer, he does argue that should focus on the positive, not the negative. So instead of thou shalt not, it should be, what are the things that you should do? You should love your neighbor. You should be generous. It's not don't kill, it's love your neighbor. And if you focus on loving your neighbor, you're not going to kill people, because that's not how you love your neighbor. So it is a more positive focus. He believes that pedagogically that's probably better. He does acknowledge that there's a requirement to act in the face of evil. That proverb of all that evil needs to win or needs to triumph is that good men do nothing. That's the same sentiment that's going on. That's what Bonhoeffer is kind of driving at here. He was a pacifist, although, as I mentioned, it's unclear. Definitely the charge against him was that he was one of the conspirators against Hitler. It's unclear to what extent he was a conspirator, or that's just the charge that Hitler gave against him. Definitely he worked against the German Reich during that time period, and just kind of to go over very briefly a little bit of his life. He was out of Germany at the time that Hitler was coming to power. He spent time in at Union College, Union in New York, University of New York, and which is where he developed a lot of where the reading comes from Cross Discipleship. At least a lot of those ideas came out of that. But he made the decision, very conscious decision, to go back into Germany to work with the confessing church against the state church, which he believed had sold out, to start the seminary of sorts at Finkenwalde, and continue to really act as a very pastoral figure in the concentration camp after he had been arrested. So that's again, more about his life. It's in a church history class, but I encourage you to read more about his life. Kind of getting more into that, into the reading. So he makes a distinction between cheap grace and costly grace. That terminology comes from Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., who's pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. So that's where it came from. A little bit more about what that distinction is. So cheap grace is that it's grace without charge. Costly grace is it costs God everything. Cheap grace doesn't require repentance, whereas costly grace requires you to take account of your life. That great line that when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Like that's costly grace. That's really what a lot of what the cost of discipleship is working that out, using the framework of the Sermon on the Mount for a lot of that early on, and then kind of moving into other areas. But a lot of it's just working out what that costly grace is. For Bonhoeffer, ethics is really more about the wholeness of life and living a life of wholeness instead of living this kind of more fragmented life. So that's really a big point for Bonhoeffer's ethics as well. We don't have a whole lot of time to talk about that. I would love to continue talking about that, but we're going to move on. Karl Barth, contemporary of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he founded a movement known as Neo-Orthodoxy, and this started probably with the reissued commentary on Romans, which is essentially a rewrite on his first edition of the Book of Romans. So that's really where you could say that maybe Neo-Orthodoxy turned. Definitely where the turn, what's referred to as the turn for Karl Barth occurred, is with that second edition. His theology in general focuses on God's actions toward us in the person of Jesus Christ, as well as our actions back toward God. So God acting manward and man acting Godward. It's dogmatic, not philosophical, and that really is a rejection of what he saw as the modernism of Schleiermacher in particular. So we really want to get away from that. He talks about doctrine quite a bit. It's centered around doctrine. That for Barth, doctrine is its own language. It has a grammar. Kind of counter Schleiermacher, it's not an account of religious experience. Now, Lindbeck, one of Barth's interpreters that your textbook kind of mentions, he takes this to an extreme. It's unclear if Barth probably would have taken it that far. But that's, definitely the seeds were there. He also wants to reject this assumption of ethics and moral duty to the state. He believes that this is the failing that you see in World War I and later World War II. This is the fundamental failing of Hegelian ethics, the Sittlichkeit that we talked about previously. That really ethics cannot be just something that the state is in charge of. That doesn't make any sense. That's politics. That's not ethics, and he does want to draw a distinction between those two. If you're going to characterize this as ethics, it's kind of a blend of divine command theory, narrative theology, and virtue ethics, but it wants to reject this notion of universal ethics. So there's a lot of things going on there. The reason I say divine command theory is, for Barth, it's because God is with us in Christ, Christ being the Word of God. Obedience to God is an expression of that fellowship. So that's that Christ exhibits his love through his Word. The idea that God has spoken it through and in and by and as Christ. And so our obedience to God is an expression of that same fellowship. And this is kind of where you get a little bit of that. It would be wrong to say he's a full-on divine command theorist. You get a little bit of that. Another interpreter of Barth, Wojciechowski, says that God's commands are right because God commands them. But what God commands is always bound to the divine decision that is Jesus Christ. So that's kind of a way to understand that relationship to divine commanding. So it has some elements of that, but there's not the sense that God just commanded anything. God chooses to bind himself to the decision found in Jesus Christ, who is also God, or not found in that is Jesus Christ rather. Okay, continuing on. We're going to kind of fly through this a little bit because I realize I'm dragging on a bit on some of this. So God's actions toward us are understood through the biblical narrative culminating in the ultimate God acting manward action of the incarnation, culminating in the crucifixion, and then later the resurrection. And it Simon's that action also demonstrates that God in the incarnate is also perfected man acting Godward. So you have both of those elements happening at the same time. So where ethics come from is that the elect live in grateful witness, that's his term, to God, and the elect desires to act toward God as ethical and moral gratitude. to God. So that's where the motivation behind ethics is. He has reformed, so he's going to talk in terms of the elect. Barth also has tones of virtue ethics with its emphasis on the transformative power in the elect. He's not going to be a virtue ethicist, but there's tones of that there. It's not Kantian, and it's definitely not universalist in the traditional sense, but an argument can be made that for Barth, it's just for the elect, but ultimately all individuals are elect. That's a semi-controversial argument. I mean, it's pretty well held by most Spartan scholars that that was kind of Barth's view. So it does end up applying to everyone, but not for any kind of rationalist, foundationalist reason behind that. So it's more of a relational virtue ethic, but it's not this rationalist decisionist-based ethics, as it's sometimes characterized to be. So that's Barth in summary. Now we're moving to Alistair MacIntyre, act of virtue. And MacIntyre kind of highlights that there's this crisis of morality, that modernist ethics is basically over and done. He does point out, like I said, we read a little bit of that piece, that kind of rhetorical piece where he opens talking about, imagine a society where they talk about science and you have quantum mechanics and they're talking past relativity physics, and they're talking about past Newtonians, and they don't know what each other are saying. And they use these technical terms in consistent manner, like neutrinos, but it doesn't mean the same thing that you thought it would mean. So that's kind of how he opens it. And he says that's really where we're at with ethics today. The ones who are doing modern ethics, they don't speak to each other. They can't talk to the Aristotelians, and they can't speak to the Nietzscheans. They don't even speak the same language. The problem is that most modern ethical theories are neither objective nor are they internally consistent. So he is willing to say that, yes, Friedrich Nietzsche was correct in his argument against modernism. He's not going to say that Nietzsche wins. In fact, that's one of his big points, is that if he does win, it's only by default. Instead, he's going to say, no, we need to really go back to the pre-modern era and look at what's going on there. So he does say that it's possible that you could have a moral pluralism, a type of relativism, but that only works if and only if that means that an ordered dialogue of intersecting viewpoints, and he doesn't view that as something that's possible. We're not able to have that dialogue. We just talk past each other. Again, critiquing what he calls the Enlightenment Project, he says it was, as we mentioned, it's meant to create an objective universal consensus of truth. But this was rendered impossible following Hume and Kant, and smashed by the hammer of Nietzsche. For Hume and Kant, it was just that the problem of empiricism that David Hume brings up, and that Kant kind of resolves, but in an unexpected way, and then Nietzsche just kind of throws it all out at that point. It's kind of saying, why are you trying to salvage this? Let's just embrace that it's over and done with. And so he says that there is, because you have these non-rational sources that form a lot of presuppositions and to the way that we do ethics, and really the way that we do everything, that we tell ourselves, as he refers in one area, as useful fictions, we really don't have that objectivity and universality that we think we have. So there's not a possibility of dialogue between that. So his response is that we need to get away from having a rationalist, foundationalist grounding for ethics, and instead look for a naturalist grounding for ethics. That's kind of his main way to resolve that. Some of his critics say that this falls prey to what's known as the fact-value gap. That is, what can be proven, but saying that what is something that can be proven, but what ought cannot be proven. He says that that's an artificial distinction, and if we're going to go back to a pre-modern era, which we kind of have to if we're not going to be full-on nihilists, although perhaps existentialists, but if we're not going to do that, then we're going to go back to a world where that distinction between whether that you can prove facts but you can't prove values, that doesn't exist for Aristotle. So if we're going back to that pre-modern era, That's not something that we need to talk about. So he says that really when we talk about morality, kind of to summarize all of the history of philosophy and morality, that there are three kind of areas or avenues that dominate Western philosophy. Tradition, which he argues is inescapable, and objectivity is a myth. So if tradition is not escapable, if objectivity is myth, in particular if objectivity is myth, then the choice becomes either Nietzsche or Aristotle. But you can only reject Aristotle, and this is really his main argument. You only reject Aristotle if you also reject the idea that people have a purpose. If you want to believe that there's a purpose that you have here, there's a human telos. If you accept that, then you're an Aristotelian. If you don't believe that there's any purpose, then yeah, be a Nietzschean. You can't have the second view, the encyclopedia view. You can't have that view. That is not possible because you tell yourself that you don't have tradition, that's an objective view, but really you're just being blind to your traditions. So it says really you should be Aristotelian. You should not be a nihilist, but you can't be an enlightenment. Not truly. You're not consistently. You're telling yourself some other lie in order to do that. So he says that you can accept the telos, the idea that you have a purpose, that you are driving at a specific end. That for Aristotle, it's that idea that eudaimonia and that you're driving at an end and all that kind of stuff. But you accept it for non-rational, or what he calls extra-rational reasons. So that's the first option. Second option is kind of where the history of philosophy went to, encyclopedia. The third option is genealogy. The idea that there are no objective values, only emotions and emotive values. Now, McIntyre is willing to say that, yeah, there's not an objective position, but that makes this whole idea of genealogy self-defeating. If there's not an objective position, you can't talk about there being an objective way. You can't say that you should be a nihilist because there are no shoulds anymore. Instead, what you need is something more comprehensive, more true than this objectivity that you're getting at, and more valuable. And he thinks that that's really found in virtue ethics. So that, very briefly is kind of where McIntyre begins to develop his ethics. He goes on to talk about it in other areas. That's kind of where it begins. Of the three traditions, only virtue ethics, he believes, is the one that is internally consistent. Because like I said, with the genealogy view, the nihilist and the Nietzschean view, it's not internally consistent. The encyclopedia view is just telling itself lies. So neither of those are going to work. In another work, Dependent Rational Animals, McIntyre makes the argument that virtue ethics should be adopted really just for practical reasons even. Like, yes, these other reasons, but also just practical reasons. People need to feel that they have a purpose, that they have some end that they're driving at. So regardless of the truth claims, you should accept virtue ethics just for that reason alone. The benefit of that is, again, if you acknowledge that there is no objectivity about it, you don't have to worry about the encyclopedia view, the Enlightenment position, the modernist view. But kind of along with that, if you say it doesn't really matter what the truth claims are, the nihilists can't object to that because they also are denying that there is any objective truth about it. So that's kind of where he gets to with dependent rational animals as well. Okay, moving on. John Milbank, he refers to his kind of view as postmodern critical Augustinianism. So he wants to deny that there is any distinction between faith and reason or between reason and revelation. That really this is a more fluid flow between these different ideas. It's not just one or the other. So there's not a distinction between the two, or between any of them really. And he does make the point that all creation participates in the being of God, and by participating in that being of God, you glimpse these incomplete pictures of it. This doesn't extend just to living things that people make. Human constructs also participate in the being of God. Works of art draw your attention to the beauty of God and therefore participates in the being of God. This is that Augustinian Platonic model that you're getting on here. Theology functions as theurgy, which is a kind of a blending together of theology and liturgy. So it's a human thing, it's a human work. Theology is that, but it's a liturgy, but it's something that has been perfected by God. So it's not just a human construct. It is something that God takes and then perfects. So it can be incomplete, but it does give glimpses of this incomplete picture of God. Like MacIntyre, Milbank accepts the Nietzschean critique that there is no objective grounding for truth, but he is unwilling to say that there is no truth. There is a truth for Milbank. It's just that truth is infinite, and because it's infinite, that's why we can't use it as a grounding. It's too far beyond us. And it's not just infinite in its being, it's infinite in its relationship to us as well. So we only find pictures and glimpses of it. We will never attain at the full truth, but you find that, he thinks, primarily narratively. That's where you find it. The material, the physical world, is only affirmed through the transcendent, through God kind of reaching in. He affirms the material world. And for Milbank, salvation is both cosmic and communal, meaning it's the entire universe, it's the world, it's everything that we've made, but focused on the community of Christ as well. It functions through that community of Christ to the greater cosmos. The idea that you as a person, you share in the nature of other people as well. So keeping on with Milbank, he does give this critique of John Duns Scotus. He thinks that that's where really things went downhill in history philosophy. He rejects his univocity of being. He wants to create a true postmodernism, something that rejects the Nietzschean skepticism as too rational, overly rational, and he also wants to reject all forms of violence, because this he sees in Aquinas, he sees in Augustine, he does not see in Aristotle. In fact, he thinks that Aristotle promotes violence. So he says that you need to reject that and instead focus on the peace of Christ. Because remember, for Aristotle, one of the key virtues is bravery, and that's found in warfare. He's going to reject that and say that no, we're peaceable people as well. So he's not going to be on board with MacIntyre, who really likes Aristotle. He likes Aquinas too, but MacIntyre really likes Aristotle. Instead, Milbank is going to focus on Augustine and Aquinas a little bit, but really Augustine. And really a lot of what this work is striving for the revitalization of Christendom. Again, it's post-foundationalist. I think we've talked about that enough. It's a narrative theology, so it believes that God reveals himself through story. We learn about God through story. We're going to tell stories, that kind of thing. He believes that liberal modernism, as is not his view, but modernism, is a result of a hermeneutic driving by theology faith with an ontology of violence as its foundation. That is, liberal modernism looks at not what the bigger narrative of history is, but the received narrative of history. The idea that winners write the history. They're the ones giving us theology. Can we get back to something before then? And he thinks that you do find that with Augustine. Christian ethics is just a different sort of politics. He believes that these are very interwoven, driven by a different hermeneutic, guided by a broader and better narrative for Milbank. He doesn't reject the emotivism like MacIntyre does. He does think that that is a key aspect to it. In fact, he thinks that really that you just have these different narratives. So this is where you're going to get that sense of there are different truths out there. He thinks that his truth is just a better truth. That's kind of a more simplified, naive way to put it, maybe. But that really these different narratives are a matter of literary taste, is the way he referred to it. And the job of the Christian is to tell a better story, to out-narrate the other narratives. And he does think that he does acknowledge that there's a lot of foreign narratives brought in there. He's fully willing to accept that. He doesn't focus as much on like the Platonic narrative, where you might think that a lot of people would go. Instead, he's looking again to liberal modernism, and think that the narratives of violence, especially that you see, what we're going to talk about in the next lecture a little bit with liberation theology, you see some Marxism and that kind of thing, that is something that needs to be cleansed out of. It's foreign to Christianity because it is focused on violence. So a lot of this ends up being a revisitation of virtue ethics. So you have a renewed emphasis on people and character over rules and application. There's a heavy emphasis on the importance of habit, as you see with virtue ethics. Community and history, and this is a little bit different than what we saw first time with virtue ethics. So with this renewal, community, how the virtues function in community, and how we got to this point. They want to acknowledge the history of how we got to this point. A big part of this renewal is to shift away from decisionist ethics, away from just making good choices and instead making good people, because good people make good choices. This is related to all the different virtues are related. So if you're doing virtue ethics well, focusing on one virtue, if it's truly virtue, is going to highlight and bring out other virtues as well. Virtue is also rightly ordered love. Like, you do love everyone, you love God, you love your family, but you love these different people and groups in different ways. So a lot of what virtue ethics is understanding how to order that love by your actions. So the terminology used for virtue ethics, we talk about practice, that you practice virtue ethics is something that you work out. The telos, it's aimed at a specific end, and tradition, that we're going to highlight and remember the tradition that leads us to this point. Okay, so that's virtue ethics kind of as it was revisited. We're going to shift gears a little bit into what's known as post-liberalism and getting into a little bit of Stanley Hauerwasser light. So post-liberalism, also known as narrative theology, also known as the Yale School of Theology because it started at Yale, has 5 characteristics. It's non-foundational. So again, that doesn't have a strong foundation with it. It's intratextual. So that idea of intratextual, meaning that you have basically dialogues happening within itself, kind of overlapping. The narrative kind of works within its own. There's an inner cohesiveness and cohesion to it. It's socially centered. So it's focused on people and society and these communities and how we interrelate with each other. Respects diversity. Not just ethnic diversity, but also diversity of experience, diversity of opinion, diversity of histories. It has a generous orthodoxy, so it's that idea of the big tent. We're going to, invite more people in than we're going to kick people out. There's an emphasis on language games. This isn't highlighted as often, but this is very much present. It's present in a lot of postmodernist thought. Language games really is highlighted by Ludwig Wittgenstein, and is really where you first see this kind of come out. And for Wittgenstein, language, kind of after he abandons the his early 20th century project, so Wittgenstein begins to look at what the nature of language is. And he really begins to think that it's less about a means of a tool to attain truth, but more that we play these language games with each other. And just like any game, there are a set of rules. But like any game that's been played for a really long time, there's the written rules and there's the house rules, or the spoken and the unspoken rules. So these rules change a little bit. Sometimes they don't. So like in English, you have certain formal rules, like grammar, essentially. But then you have a lot of unspoken rules. So I think the example I use in class is it's every Tom, Dick, and Harry. You wouldn't say it's every Harry, Dick, and Tom. Something just sounds wrong to a native English speaker about that. There's no rule that says you can't do that. It's not written down anywhere, but it just sounds wrong. It probably is written down a few places now that people have talked about this, but that's the idea. And that these rules that for the game change depending on which community that you're in. Now, if you've worked in churches for a while, you know that this is the case. Like, you use words in church, your church community, that you don't use outside that community. Words like sin, sanctification, salvation. You talk about blood a lot, but you're not talking about it. Like you don't work at a hospital, so why are you talking about blood all the time? Um, there are certain rules to this, what Wittgenstein refers to as a game that you're playing. Um, so there is an understanding in a lot of post-liberal theology that by getting a better understanding of the games that we're playing and kind of dissecting it and deconstructing it, as it were, that we can kind of get to the real issues that we're dealing with. And so I think for ethics in particular, one of the better points for this is Stanley Hauerwas. So kind of to give a better idea of what the importance of language is in here. One point is, I think, in a speech he's giving, or a Q&A, he opens a Q&A saying, you can only act in the world you can see, and you can only see by learning to say. I know it's on the screen, but I'm going to read it one time. You can only act in a world you can see, and you can only see by learning to say. So, what he's talking about when it comes to moral choices and moral actions and the things that we do ethically is that it makes no sense to talk about it in this abstract sense. We have to talk about it in the world that is here as we see it. But the only way that we're ever going to get at the reality of that, of what the world actually is if we actually pay attention to the way that we use language. And so he highlights this. He uses a few different examples, but like we talk about being pro-life or pro-choice, but we never actually talk about abortion. So we talk about being, I'm pro-life or I'm pro-choice. These are reasons I'm pro-life, these are reasons I'm pro-choice, but we're not actually talking about the real issue, which the issue is abortion. And he's clear, like, we have to be careful with our language and understand how we're using that language. The way he says is another quote, descriptions are more determinative than decisions. Decisions are what you do when everything else has been lost. So his kind of point there is, like, really, when it comes to moral choices, you don't actually make a choice. The way that you approach your world, your outlook on it, the color that you have, based upon all these external factors, makes that choice for you. You don't approach it as this kind of blank slate and objectively sit down and think about what would be the best thing to do. You've made your choice based upon the way that you approach the situation. So this applies to any kind of moral quandary, really anywhere where there's a debate about it. Okay, keeping on with Hauerwas for a little bit. He kind of, again, he's wanting to get back to this. For Hauerwas especially, you see this with McIntyre also, and a lot of, they're wanting to go back in order to go forward. So again, with him, he's going to look to pre-Enlightenment to say that theologians before the Enlightenment did not make this distinction that's now made between ethical and theological. They're one and the same. So why are we making that? In fact, he believes that this is really, he's going to throw the shade at, Immanuel Kant for this, saying that it was his rationalism that's, in his terms, it divided up the questions of what you believe versus what you should do. It said that those are separate questions. What you believe is a separate question from what you should do. And by doing that, he actually undermined both. So liberalism tried to do that by looking to the subject, and that's where you get with Schleiermacher, the subjectivism and the motivism and all that. So that's what liberal theology did. In contrast to that, he says conservatism, which he also says is problematic. Hauerwas is fully aware that he has fans on both sides and people that hate him on both sides. He says conservatism is also problematic in that it, places theology. It basically makes theology into a science. It just ignores the arguments against, foundationalism and objectivism with Hume and Kant, Kant's response to Hume, and with Nietzsche. It just kind of ignores those and continues to act like, theology or ethics is really just a science, and that you can somehow get an epistemological base that's solid and secure and universal. He says really the better response is we are not thinking about it. We're not coming up with a rational, objective reason. Instead, our job is to bear witness to the narrative of God in history. That's the way that he refers to that. The proper response is to bear witness to the narrative of God in history. So what that means is that for modernism, the main critique against that is that, or that modernism rather has of narrative theology, is that it seems irrational. But Howard Watson is going to point to McIntyre's very well-reasoned argument to show that rationality is multifaceted, that there are different types of rationality. Why do we assume that rationality is just sitting and thinking about it, and thinking about it in the right way? Is there not a rationality of the community? If you look at other Enlightenment European cultures, they have different ideas for what rationality is, what counts as rationality. So why are those somehow rejected? In fact, sometimes we find that they have good answers. So that's kind of where he gets to that. He's not saying that there is no rationality. He just wants to know why one definition of rationality is kind of like like the one ring to rule them all sort of thing. Like why should it dominate all the other forms of rationality? Just starting to think about these other forms of rationality. And he talks about these 10 theses for Christian social ethics. And I think right now, for time's sake, we're going to just run through these. The gospel is necessarily social and narrative in structure. These are basically his highlighting what is needed to talk about Christian social ethics. So the gospel is necessarily social and narrative in structure. That means it requires a community, and it requires a community that has a common story and that tells stories. Second, every politic and social ethic is fundamentally narratival as well. We tell each other stories. We need to be paying attention to that. A social ethic is trustworthy to the extent that it provides a convincing narrative account. Communities are formed by trustworthy narrative. Communities that are formed by a trustworthy narrative transform fate into destiny. So instead of talking about like a fatalist, like, oh well, this is just what's going to happen. Instead, you start talking about this is what I was meant to do. That's a different framework for how we approach life. The primary task of the church is to be the church. It's not to do something else. It's not to influence power. It's not to gain political authority. It's not to do charitable work. You can say that is part of being the church, that last one, but really that task of the church is to be the church. It's to be this community organized around a transformative narrative that is convincing. Christian social ethics is incompatible with national or world control. So it kind of goes back to what I was just talking about, that it doesn't make sense in the world. In fact, he talked a lot about how it, from the kind of Enlightenment, modernist, Western mindset, it doesn't make sense. I think I mentioned a few times this kind of thought experiment that he has of why you shouldn't. The thought experiment about why should you have kids, and so he asked in a class. There's a woman who's going to be pregnant. Like, well, why should you have kids? Is it right to have kids? And they run through all these reasons why it's unhelpful, why it's not going to help anyone, and basically turns the somewhat exacerbated one that says, look, I'm just going to have kids. There's no rational reason for it. It says, exactly. You just got to do your thing. So that it doesn't make sense within the world that's set up as an Enlightenment ideal. It's not going to work with that. Christian social ethics requires that you value diversity. And by valuing the diverse gifts, this is different abilities, but also different histories, different narratives, all of that kind of falls under it. The church cannot have a social ethic. It must be a social ethic. So there's that kind of idea of it's not something that anyone can have or possess. It's something that you do and that you act. The virtuous living in community acts as the social ethic. You are not virtuous, but you collectively in community, by acting, you become that community. He does think that American Christianity is corrupted by its association with politics, and the church does not conform to any secular political identity. So Christians are not Republican, they're not Democrat, they're not independent, they're not part of a political identity, but they exist outside and in condemnation of such identities. So it is, very kind of radical in that thinking. Now, I just think that you should participate, but you be very careful about these political ideologies. Okay, getting near the end. So he uses some narrative there. The way he talks about narrative is, so he talks about it in an ethical context. Rather than asking, what should I do? You need to ask, looking at the narrative, how have I come to be here? Same thing, he doesn't want to say, who am I, but rather, how have I come to be here? Like, what has brought me to this point? That will help me answer what I should do or who I am. I need to think in those terms of how have I come to be at this present point. You need to see your story, your life, as itself a unified narrative, but also something that's part of a bigger narrative. So he thinks that theology had a narrative fall, but also ethics has a narrative fall. So there's a history where it falls. So for Hauerwas, it's theology. For McIntyre and a little bit Milbank, it's ethics. He does want to draw a distinction between telos and eschatology. Telos is something that you have now. Eschatology is what we're moving towards. So telos is your purpose, and eschatology is the fulfillment of that you see with Christ. So eschatology is to do more with the meta-narrative, whereas telos has to do with your specific narrative. Okay, so that's Hauerwas. Kind of coming into a bit of a reaction against this. You have Oliver O'Donovan. Now he wants to offer a corrective to narrative theology and to postmodern theology. And so he has to be very foundationalist. So he's going to go back to this more Enlightenment perspective, but from a more conservative standpoint. He accepts the foundationalist approach, and he rejects anything that's too historicist, that focuses too much on the history of it. Instead, he argues for not a historicist, but a biblicist return to Christendom, that there's no distinction between church and the world. For O'Donovan, theology is political. And in fact, as he sees it, the main problem that society has is that it is ignorant of the political nature, the political nature of theology. There's a political theology that undergirds all of it, that regardless of what you believe, you have a political theology. That's for O'Donovan. It tends to be very Augustinian in its more traditional interpretation, not the one that you see with Milbank, but a much more traditionalist Augustinian approach. For O'Donovan, he believes that theology has its source at the end, so you do still have this kind of end focus. Its source is at the end in the eschatological arrival of God found first in the resurrection. And for him, all believers are theologians. Like a good Protestant, all believers are theologians. Some are simply more disciplined at being theologians than others. So wish we could spend more time on on O'Donovan, really all of them. But that's where we're going to leave it. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about John Howard Yoder, just because he is really important for the history of ethics. He had influence upon Hauerwas and lots of others. He's an Anabaptist. His argument is that Christianity is inherently political, and really focuses on this extreme pacifism, this turn the other cheek. He's an Anabaptist that fits well with it. He acknowledges that pacifism might lead to more violence. Your refusal to participate in violence might lead to more violence, but it's still the correct way forward, is countering the ways of this world with a radical form of pacifism as he sees it. He believes that really for him, the principal issue or crisis in Christianity goes all the way back to Constantine, and what he calls the Constantinian shift, where no longer was Christianity on the outskirts, but it was then incorporated into empire and made to do this violent work that is really antithetical to it. So for him, he looks at, I think this is in your reading, where he looks at the Good Samaritan, when Jesus is asked, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus doesn't answer that question. He says, how can I be a neighbor? Or for Yoder, How can I be a reconciling presence in the life of my neighbor? That's really the central question for him. Now, it would be inappropriate not to mention that he does have a bit of a marred legacy. There are several accusations of sexual assault, some of them quite credible. So he does kind of have a little bit of a fall later on in his life. So I'm just acknowledging that his writings are still there. He still had massive influence, but it needs to be acknowledged. Okay, kind of last point that we're going to talk about are some of the more relevant Jewish developments during the 20th century. So two in particular I want to highlight. Martin Buber, his main work is Ich und Du. It's I and you. So it's often translated I and thou. It sounds, more highfalutin, I guess. But Ich und Du. And he draws that there's a distinction between different types of relationships we have. We have an Ich Du and an Ich Es relationship. An I you or an I thou versus an I it relationship. And the idea being that we really need to get to an I you or I thou relationship. Du really should be translated. It's odd that it's translated I and thou because du is the less formal. It's not ich und sie. Thou just sounds formal. I mean, I suppose if you're used to like King James Bible and that kind of thing, maybe it doesn't sound as formal. But the idea between du is this is an intimate, known relationship. I mean, it not be that intimate, but at least you know each other. You're not strangers. And that's kind of the idea behind the Ich und Du, is that you do know each other and that you look by looking or by relating to this other person properly, you as a you, as a thou, and not as an it, by relating to the other person as a you acknowledge and understand the eternality that exists within each of us. There's an infinite, there's a multitude of infinites within each person and within ourselves. And they are in us, and we are in them, and we both collectively are also participating in the divine. And that acknowledgement is a starting point for relationship, for proper relationship, and that leads into ethics. Now, he was a student of Manuel Levinas. Levinas was the principal of a Jewish high school. He was not an academic. So most people we've talked about were academics. I mean, he wrote some very important work, but he did not work at a university. He worked at a Jewish high school. He refers to ethics as what he labels first philosophy. That this is the most foundational, the thing that we need to approach first. It is the most important aspect. Really trying to keep this down, even though I'm already going over an hour here. But so for him, the big epiphany, which is foundational, which is first philosophy, is face-to-face encounter. To really see and acknowledge the other person. He's willing to say, though, that the other being this more relational, is a very relational ethics, is fundamentally unknowable. There's a mystery about the other. Okay, gone over a little bit past where I wanted to go, but I think that gives you a good kind of summation of where we got to. The next lecture that's going to be coming up is going to be on what we're referring to as ethics from the margins. So we're going to look at some of these other groups that have been overlooked. I recognize fully the irony of putting them all into one lecture, but that's kind of where we're at, in light of all these different circumstances. So that'll be the next one. We'll stop this right now, and we'll come back and hit that.